Good evening. I think we're going to get started. I know everybody's excited about our speaker today. So I'd like to welcome everybody to the GSD. I'm Diane Davis. I'm a professor of urbanism and development here. And it is my great pleasure to be able to introduce Eyal Weizman to all of you this evening. Like many of you, I suppose, I personally have been long inspired by Eyal's visionary and politically provocative work, which I first came across about 6 years ago when I began a project on Jerusalem, a city whose built environment and topographical surrounds figure largely in Eyal's first two books, A Civilian Occupation, The Politics of Israeli Architecture, and after that, Hollow Land, Israel's Architecture of Occupation. These two amazing books introduced me to the expansive and creative mind of Eyal, who is an architect, professor of visual cultures, and director of the Center for Research Architecture at Goldsmiths College, University of London. But my delight tonight also owes to my conviction that Eyal's work has combined, in the form of a single career, the range of epistemologies, political concerns, methodological, representational, visual techniques, and disciplinary subfields that comprise the GSD, our home, in its entirety. Thus, I can think of no better person to have in our midst, someone who will challenge us tonight with his insight and wisdom, no matter our course of study or intellectual home base. So let me describe what I mean by that. Starting out as an architect, Eyal moved rapidly into what some would consider to be landscape architecture or urban design, through his work on the relations between Israel's mountain ranges, deserts, and agricultural landscape, as well as the building of settlements and cities in the country of Israel. His efforts to situate these and other geographical developments in the context of contested sovereignty always indicated a shared affinity with the governance aspects of planning, or that is what I took out of his work. But now with the newest project, which we're going to hear more about tonight, forensic architecture, Eyal is immersing himself in questions of humanitarian law, human rights, representation, and interpretation of conflict, all issues that lace through our school's planning curriculum in a very deep and direct way, yet at the same time linking them to some of the most important methodological and technical transformations in the design disciplines. I'm speaking here of the ways that Eyal's new project is interrogating the materiality of war and other forms of conflict through mapping, GIS, photographs and videos, and other media or representational techniques, as well as the way he engages the larger world through a critical deconstruction of sites and events of war that can enable more open dialogue and hopefully a more humanitarian and just politics. What many have long applauded, while many have long applauded Eyal for his willingness to place the relationship between architecture and politics at the center of his work, especially in the form of research and cultural criticism, this is a man who never shied away from bridging the theory and practice world, and he was committed to changing discourse and conditions in academia as well as in the real world. And I think the latter is well represented by his role as a founding member of the architectural collective Decolonizing Architecture, DAAR, in Beit Sahour, Palestine, as well as his work with a variety of NGOs worldwide, including the Israeli Planning, Design, and Architecture Collaborative. I know some people in this one, B'Tselem, where he's a member of the board of directors. But I want to suggest that with the newest turn in his research and practice, which we're going to hear more about tonight, I think he's breaking new boundaries in the examination of materiality, or what he has called spatial evidence, as a lens through which to unpack the social, political, and cultural infrastructures of power, particularly as manifest in its most intense form, which is war and the violence that entails. This is a project that not only has his critical eye circulating through Israel, but also other locations, and Gaza, I would say the West Bank and Gaza, but also the former Yugoslavia, Guatemala, Libya. I have a few places I'd like to put on the map of your list of countries that we need to look at. And so this work brings him back into his initial engagement with the landscapes and terrains that have been destroyed through conflict and war, but in new ways that speak to us and inspire hope especially when this evidence is connected to public consciousness through far-ranging from public art performances to judicial trials. Before turning over to Eyal, who I'm going to say just a few more words about his incredibly impressive career accomplishments. He's at Goldsmiths, I've mentioned before, but before that, Weizman has been a professor of architecture at the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna. He's taught at the Bartlett School at London, the Stadel School in Frankfurt, and an invited professor at the École, I don't speak French, Antoine, you're going to have to help me here, École des Higher Studies in Paris. He's lectured, curated, and organized conferences in many institutions worldwide. His books include Mengele's Skull, Forensic Architecture, The Least of All Possible Evils, Hollow Land, A Civilian Occupation, as I mentioned, and a series of other publications. He's currently on the advisory boards of the Institute of Contemporary Art in London, the Human Rights Project at Bard College in New York, and he's a recipient of the James Sterling Memorial Lecture Prize, in 2007, the 2010 Prince Claus Prize for Architecture, numerous other awards. Friends, without further ado, let me introduce Eyal Weizman.
Thank you. This was really a wonderful and generous introduction, Diane. I'd like to really start with some methodological points to do before we are diving into the case studies. If some strands or friends in the field of algorithmic design tell me material reality is a mediation of forces into form, then forensic architecture makes a similar, if inverse, move. It is a strand of architectural research that, while studying formal organization, and I will show you today the kind of scales that we are dealing with, really from very minute scale of the details of domestic walls to larger territories. And maybe we can even start with the first slide. While doing that, it reconstructs as much as it possibly can forces from material investigation and try to build a case that convinces a certain collective. So in forensic architecture, we are looking really at two areas or sites that I called fields and forums. In fields, within our research, it's an attempt to unpack, harvest, or extract material forces from form. Forums is the way in which the presentation of that data within different juridical, political, or professional forums attempts to arrive or to help in arriving at a decision in a certain sense. So this image that is taken from my previous work that Diane mentioned so kindly, the Hollow Land, it is a detail of a map of the West Bank, and in purpose there is no measures of scale or any other indications, because what I have taken from that map is really an analysis of formal organization, and to look at the settlements and areas under their jurisdiction and areas that, of their expansion in the spectrum of blue, and understand that in every twist and turn of this complex morphology, there are political forces slowing down into form, right? And if it is like that, we can look at material reality and attempt to harvest backwards those forces, whether they are political, military, juridical, economical, from looking at form. So we are, and my first attempt, my first entry into that field of forensic architecture about 10 years ago was an attempt to write an entire report that ties those elastic behavior of material reality across the colonial frontier of Israeli colonization of the West Bank, and try to unpack, almost like an archaeologist looks at a fragment of material reality and try to kind of build it into the matrix of political relations to which it belongs. In fact, to make that drawing represent the kind of reality I want it to, I should be able to press play on it, and you would see every change in the kind of geopolitical force field translated into changes within that material organizations in the boundaries of areas under Palestinian control in the spectrum of Brown, or those colonies that are in there. But I'm also interested in cracks. This is, of course, the beautiful work of Doris Salcedo at the Tate, on which I've written. And it is interesting, even if we are looking now into kind of the scale of the very domestic, of thinking about cracks in buildings as another material manifestation of a translation of force contradictions into the line of least resistance. In a sense, I'm interested in cracks, as you will see in some of the examples, if we'll have time, of analysis that we've undertaken, because they connect geological formation or geological tension into architectural one as they travel through the line of least resistance within concrete, for example. They appear and disappear. They move from buildings to sidewalks to the city and can appear again. And in that sense, kind of the edge, the edge of where architecture begins and the city starts, or the other way around, is kind of blurred by the movement of cracks, right? So again, I think that in understanding forensic architecture, we need to think across scales, from the micro to the very large one. So politics is a process of materialization. Once I called architecture the political plastic, to describe the elastic way by which abstract forces of political, economical, or military nature, a multivalented force field, is slowing into form, or, as in other instances, how condensed matter accelerates in a blast. My claim in this talk is as to show how to invert the act of architecture. In order to get to the architecture, we need to invert, I think, the act of architecture in order to get to architecture's essence as a media form. When I mean a media form, I mean something that could both register and transmit. In that sense, it kind of turns times backward as we create not ever new form from forces, but try to harvest or unpack something of the political forces that are fossilized into the organization or form. And this is the project that I've set up with an incredibly generous help of the EU, the European Commission for Research, ERC, that is a multidisciplinary project that is based at the Center for Research Architecture at Goldsmiths, and include different participants from C2 Studio, an office that is based in Brooklyn, to a group of lawyers, critical legal studies people, architects, filmmakers, and artists. All of them are committed to start thinking the nature of space as evidence and understand that the modes and means of its presentation is what makes it function and what gives it effect within the different forums in which it is presented. In this project, really, there is a kind of an inbuilt schizophrenia. On the one hand, we are giving services mainly for prosecutions in prosecution teams in trials dealing with human rights or war crimes. And we are working in Strasbourg, in the Court for Human Rights in Strasbourg, in Guatemala, in former Yugoslavia, in many other places, by providing the kind of the package of architectural evidence in those courts, producing really and insisting that architecture must take its place as one of the most important evidence for human rights violation and war crimes. And simultaneously to doing that, kind of writing the history and theory of forensic and forensic architecture in that sense. Sometimes those two strands of our research actually kind of exist in contradiction, because sometimes as an expert witness you need to kind of assume a complete neutrality, whereas as somebody who is undertaking a critical research into the notion of forensic and forensic architecture in particular, you want to sort of think critically your own methodology. Forensic architecture refers to the practice of building surveyors. So that kind of term exists or pre-existed our research. These are building surveyors providing expert testimony in court. But if we, or if we try as we have, extract the term from the specialized context of insurance dispute, however, it could become a general strategy for architectural research and inquiry, expanding the scope of what architectural knowledge can achieve in the world today. I will thus claim that forensic architecture is not a minor application of architectural intelligence and knowledge, but is at the heart of what we can define as architectural research. And in a sense, I think that architectural research has been very comfortable in doing one of two things recently: either producing the information, knowledge necessary for intervention, for architectural intervention to happen. So we conduct site research in order to derive the kind of the conditions against which our intervention would happen, or has operated in a kind of as a critical discourse, mainly within academia, sometimes within galleries and the art world. But I think that when architecture and architectural evidence is presented in court, it faces the most intense and sometimes violent form of cross-investigation, where the research really needs to kind of be constructed in a certain way that makes its statement evident. The pyramids of Gaza. You know, I mean, I'm not meaning the pyramids of Giza, which are 200 kilometers to the west, but the pyramids of Gaza has been one of the first problems of forensic architecture, and they relate to the Israeli attack on Gaza in 2008-2009. The pyramids of Gaza emerge out of a combination between two elements that are very prevalent to the Gaza Strip. A three-story residential building of the kind that is very often the home for refugees, and as you know, about 2/3 of the residents of Gaza are refugees, and a D9 Caterpillar bulldozer. As the bulldozer tried to destabilize the building, its shovel can only topple or destroy the peripheral column. The central columns are staying intact, forming the peak of the pyramid, around which the slabs are breaking and then kind of falling to the side. Right? So when we are starting to see that type of destruction, we can understand from it various things, right? We can understand the kind of building typology of Gaza with its own history. We can understand a change in Israeli military warfare technique, etc. And that the question always of war crimes is, in a sense, they are different than the sort of criminal code, because they involved an incredible amount of players. Some of them politicians, military. The condition that kind of brings war to do exactly what it does, or to register itself in a particular way in the built environment, is due to many more players. And the idea is really to try to start from material reality and reconstruct those networks, those chain of commands the particular political ideology that drives it, etc., etc. No? So it is really between the kind of the materiality and the abstract conditions of war that this project seek to intervene in. For several years, I've been working on providing human rights evidence, dealing with architecture not as a projective design practice, but as a diagnostic technique, the diagnostic of war crime and human rights violation. And in that sense, we can say, or it's now commonplace to say, that with the urbanization of conflict, violation of human rights and laws of war take place within cities. Most often, these violations are undertaken by the means of architecture, both by form of construction and destruction. Barriers and ruins are the interrelated products of contemporary conflict. Because violations are undertaken by the means of architecture, architectural representation, maps, plans, satellite images, air and drone images, physical and digital model are continuously called upon as evidence in tribunal and international court. Architecture, as a set of spatial representation, is rapidly becoming the pathology of our contemporary era. Today's forums, such as international institution, tribunal, fact-finding mission, and organization that regulate the environment, are conducting political, regulatory, and juridical process based on ever new ways of imaging and modeling the surface of the earth. And I think that it is very familiar to all of you, especially in kind of sequences of before and after images that are somehow our entry point into understanding now political processes. So claims about genocide in Darfur often validated or expressed through those before and after images, which becomes a certain archaeology, but it's not an archaeology of that really kind of goes to place and deal with the physicality of things. It's an archaeology of images, archaeology of pixels, of wavelength, of looking in various types of photography and remote sensing, counting the numbers of destruction, or trying to understand a kind of archaeology of post-attack as in this situation where a military base in Iran has been supposedly under attack, or an accident where an enormous amount of experts are trying to interpret those satellite images, trying to understand the kind of the nature of the event, or questions about development of nuclear capacity, etc., are kind of read in transformation of the landscape. The political event, to a certain extent, is replaced by the architectural one. The kind of the shifting of material reality, the change between the before and the after, is seen as the kind of the embodiment of these transformations. In the Israeli attack on Gaza, nearly 1,400 people were killed and about 15,000 buildings were destroyed. These are about 15% of all buildings in Gaza. These facts are related. According to various reports, almost all deaths occurred within buildings, and the majority of people killed died in their own homes. So in this war, buildings are not merely the backdrop of war, and the city is not merely its location or its target, but rather architecture is the very means by which people were killed. People in this attack, as in many other wars worldwide, were killed by bits of their homes flying at them at high speed. So this creates the kind of the necessity for forensic architecture. Forensics as a term refers to all things pertaining to the court of law and is most commonly used to describe the application of science in legal context. But forensics has a different meaning, and this is the meaning that we try to kind of develop in our own project originally. So the Latin source of the term comes from forensis, or the art of the forum. It is not necessarily something that pertains to law, but pertain to rhetoric. Rhetoric is about speech. But in forensics, it is not only people that speak, but things, objects, buildings are called to speak. Therefore, the forensic triangle involves a relation, a continuously shifting relation between three categories. An object or a building that is called to testify, an interpreter, which is in ancient Roman time, and you can read more about our kind of unpacking of the history of that on our website or books, either the rhetorician or the expert witness, and the forum, right? The forum gathers around the object that is called to speak by its interpreter. Therefore, I think that this image is a kind of a perfect illustration of a forensic moment. Because in this particular attack, architecture and architectural analysis of destruction was seen as the most important evidence. A press conference is called, in which the building is called to testify because the building cannot speak. Goldstone here, in the famous judge who led the commission of inquiry into this Israeli attack, is translating or speaking for the building in front of this bouquet of microphone that kind of stands for the international forum. So we have to think about the forensic moment as a continuously shifting relation around that. And for me, the shifting of the term forensics into the forum, right, from the law into the art of the forum, means to say that architectural research, in order to gain its effect in the world, has to sometimes construct the very forums in which the evidence itself would be called to testify, right? It needs the forum, the kind of, in order to operate in the world, the presentation of architectural research need a particular kind of form of institutional collectivity that is called a forum. I'll skip both this type of cataloging of destruction that happened both by in the frame of international law and the Goldstone report, and equally by the Hamas government of Gaza, who has created that book of destruction of all things within it. Something that is incredibly important in the definition of forensics is that it shifted something in human rights culture. As you know, human rights, I mean, this is what it, in its name, human rights, is based very much on testimony, on human testimony, on testimony of victims. In fact, the emergence of the human rights movement in the 70s is very much based around the kind of notion of testimony, which was never simply epistemological, i.e. what the witness says, but ethical, to speak to victims of war as a kind of a form of empathy and identification. At some point, and this moment here is the trial of the leaders of the Argentine junta in Buenos Aires in the 80s. In human rights context, evidence, physical evidence, start invading the space of the human voice, right? That is kind of the shift from what legal scholars call the era of the witness into what we call the kind of the period of the forensic aesthetics. The man here in this photograph is Clyde Snow. Snow is one of the great grave diggers of the 20th century. He's the man that has undertaken investigation on the body both of Tutankhamun, the files of JFK, and the skull of Mengele, as I will show later. And here he is presenting a skull in court. His way of addressing his evidence continues that blaring between object and subject that the forensic moment always kind of embodies. Snow refers to his skulls, the skulls that he presents in court, as witnesses. He says, "Bone make great witnesses. They never forget and they never lie." So there's a strange idea in this presentation, right? We would say a witness, subject, a person is a witness and could be investigated and cross-investigated. An object is evidence, is presented. But here an object is treated as a witness. But not only the object is presented as a kind of quasi-subject. By doing that, it becomes a certain super-subject, right? Because as people, of course, we forget and we often lie. So what does it mean, the object never forget and never lies? I would say, and I would propose in this presentation, that actually it's rather the opposite. And it is through the kind of the arduous process of truth production that, so it's not as if truth is just lying there, fossilized in the object, waiting to be harvested. In order to make it speak, a whole mechanism and a whole set of theatricality, presentation, all those things that we call the forensic aesthetics have to kind of to mediate that and make it happen. Here is a kind of an example exactly from the Goldstone report of what I refer to as a shift from the era of the kind of the subject or the witness to that of the object. Here, I'll just run those several times. The person who is showing it is Mark Garlasco, is one of the people that conducted most of the research on the ruins of Gaza. And being a human rights activist, he goes to a place and he takes a photograph. And as most human rights people do, they take photograph of victims in front of the ruins, or here, a woman sitting admirably steadfast in front of the ruins of her home. But when he comes to narrate that image, everything that is interesting is the trash and rubble behind, from which he is actually reconstructing the story of the battle. So again, we need to kind of understand that relation of the object called to speak, the interpreter, and the forum, that sort of, that triangle, that shifting triangle that forensic is. So if most scholars, critical legal scholars, would regard that moment as the moment of the kind of the emergence of forensic into war crime investigation, there's a story that is a little, that happened just several weeks before the trial of the Argentine junta, and in fact led to it. And that is the something that Thomas Keenan and I unpacked in our book called Mengele's Skull. Strangely, in order to kind of to move back and to understand the notion of forensic architecture, we had to move into kind of the forensics of bones. And the history of that in a particular exhumation that happened in a small suburb of Sao Paulo in 1985, where a group of gravediggers have thought that they've arrived at the gravesite of Joseph Mengele. As you know, there was a great hunt for him, and the trial that was kind of proposed in the United States or in Israel of that famous doctor from Auschwitz that ended and led them into that gravesite. But the problem was to identify really whether that skull or whether that skeleton belonged indeed to Mengele. And as it happened, when you have a kind of, let's say, well-funded question in science, about 20 of the most famous pathologists of the time arrived from Germany, from Israel, from America, from Brazil, from Argentina, and organized themselves around the gurney in that particular morgue in Embu des Artes, this little town that I mentioned. And as it happens, when you put a group of such brains together, they came up with a new science that was called Osteo Biography, or kind of a technique, Osteo Biography. In its very term, you see again a kind of the blurring between object and subject that forensics has. The reason I'm interested in that and in bones is that osteobiography is not really about seeing in the bone the moment of a trauma, a break, a bullet entry point, or a cut, etc., but to see how a life process, right, is translating itself into the morphology of the tissue, the hardened tissue of the bone. So that imagine that your life itinerary, you move from Central Europe in the 50s to Central America, from a more or less dry area to a very humid thing, would register in the form of your bone and would lend itself to analysis. Similarly, your habits, your nutrition, of course, every illnesses that you would do, you can construct a timeline and look at a piece of materiality and try to break or to kind of like harvest, extract that timeline from an analysis of the bone itself. So that is what is, I think, a rather architectural moment in that. I mean, the bone itself is a soft tissue, although it's relatively hard. It continuously mutates. It is almost, if you wish, like a negative that is exposed to life, like the negative is exposed to light, right? Very long-term exposure or multiple exposure that actually kind of shifts the and plays with the tissue of the bone. Here you would see this kind of almost insane experiment that were done by projecting images of the face onto the skull, a kind of another blaring. I find this really almost hilarious image of the skull wearing a hat, but kind of projecting images of subject onto object, death onto life, exactly those moments that create that blurring that forensics is. And I love that image of the press conference where they identified the body of Mengele, because it makes clear that this thing that was giving the press conference is actually the skull. So I went to, in order to write that book with Thomas Keenan, I had to meet and interview that famous gravedigger Clyde Snow, and in fact we met him, we interviewed him. He was very helpful in kind of providing the material for that little book, but said, in fact, he asked us, why are you interested? We explained to him that architecture could be seen in a similar way to the bone, to the way it describes the bone, as a kind of ways in which processes, long processes become form, and in which you can harvest those processes from looking into form. And he sent us immediately to Guatemala, where the biggest forensic investigation now in the world is taking place, with about 150 gravediggers moving up the cloud forest in the highland of Guatemala, trying to kind of unearth the remains of some of the 200,000, mainly Ixchil Mayas, that were killed during the American and also Israeli-sponsored civil war and repression there. So this is some images of our trip. And this is not an image by us, but something that kind of shows you another one of those forensic moments where the bodies here held in the boxes, a kind of a religious forum sort of opens around it, something between science and religion. But our task was really to uncover the remains of the villages themselves. As you know, those Maya villages were rather rudimentary in the 80s, built mainly out of organic material, and the jungle, if you would just refer to it right now as such, accelerates the form of the disintegration of the organic materials of it. So after 20, 30 years, there was nothing that was remaining of those villages, 400 villages that we had to look for together with our hosts or to help in kind of locate moving up the valleys. And really it was a kind of a tuning into mainly done by the Guatemala Forensic Anthropology Foundation, a kind of tuning into types of vegetation where you see a kind of a higher concentration of avocado trees or sort of wild wheat. You kind of know that these sites are near, and you can find, I mean, this is a more obvious one, kind of the hard foundations of those buildings. But in order to do that, we had to use also, and this is together with C2 Studio again, interpretation of satellite images that are describing actually the kind of the different wavelength remote sensing images, where you can see both the sort of deforestation, the increase of the blue, and also you can see somehow the footprint of building kind of showing under that. And sort of creating now in the trials of Rios Monte in Guatemala sort of a series of analysis and sort of reenactment of the process of that genocide. It's a genocide trial where our understanding of genocide is not only that of killing people, killing those Ixchil Maya inhabitants, but a complete reorganization of the natural and man-made environment. Complete transformation, the process necessitated a complete transformation of vegetation patterns, of urbanization. People were taken, those who survived the massacres were taken from the villages and put in a kind of new organized town. So we are looking at the entire process in which the both planning, nature, and human are kind of being systematically destroyed. This is an example that it's not from Guatemala. It's an example that was given, it's a sample given to me by the people doing the technology themselves. It's a DTM image of an area of a mass grave. Basically, by looking for mass graves, airplanes will fly over areas, would sample the terrain, and would look for small irregularities in the landscape itself. So that if you have a kind of a topography, and sometimes these are 15 centimeters difference in the kind of in the shape of the topography, where the morphology of the land does not correspond with the way in which water or air run on rock. So you could see a disturbed ground that is presented as a kind of as a site of potentially of a grave, and you can see here the edges. So this is a print. This is a kind of a 3D print like you do in a computer workshop of a terrain where you see the edges where the kind of the big grave is sort of dropped here, and the kind of the swelling in the middle. And so in a sense, it's an image of death which is incredibly subtle, right? In sort of only in a kind of micro-analysis of the surface itself, you can read some of its history. And I'm interested in that, in the difference between the kind of the objective or object quality of territory and that of bone, right? The bone is finite. It's an object that has its own edges, you can bring it, etc. With territory, there is never an edge. Wherever you frame it, there is more that you could have framed, right? There's always something that kind of pours out of the frame of the image. The very framing itself is a political act. So, even within my own work, drawing a map only of the West Bank has been criticized by some others of saying, and what about, 48 Palestine? What about looking at refugee camp in Jordan, etc.? But as I showed you before, I think that in that kind of image of the political plastic, there is something we need to understand, I think, spatiality and architecture, not as a static thing, but it's something that continuously shifts. In fact, forensic architecture is not interested in unpacking something that is static, because it is in its transformation, it's in its continuous translation and retranslation, reintegration of force field into physical organization that you can capture the act of politics. No? So I would say politics is matter in movement. No? It is not, we're never analyzing, let's say, panopticon-like perfect structure that are kind of stable in as such, but looking at space exactly at the moment it transforms. And it doesn't matter if we are looking at cracks, at the air bubbles that are trapped between structure and paint on the facade of a building that responds to environmental weathering, and that is in itself, right? The environment is a political, the transformation of the environment is a political act. Or if we're looking at large territories. So we're looking really at the elasticity of space. Every space is elastic in order to to capture the moment where we see how politics intervene within form. So you would say, of course, that the wall is the absolute negation of what I was saying. You say, here is a top-down, physical, absolute, hermetic, static, material reality that breaks it. But in a sense, I would try to show you how the very power of the wall in Palestine is in its transformation rather than in its static, act as an absolute division. And you would see here immediately in that image how an outpost that is being built, and in fact, as that wall is snaking its way down from north to south through the terrain, when right-wing activists are building an outpost, a a loop emerges, like a tongue of a frog, that extends to catch it in and change the very path. But I will show you how the very elasticity of the wall operates within the court itself. So we're entering now into a legal process. The trials of the wall have always involved physical evidence. Here you see Mohammed Dahle, the Palestinian human rights lawyer, have actually provided evidence for this court. Some human rights activists setting up a PowerPoint presentation, the military putting up their map, and they try to argue it out, only that the judges itself in this process cannot read the architectural evidence. They do not understand what is high and what is low, what's a slope, what's a valley, what's an orchard, etc. All those issues that had bearing on the path of the wall itself. So much like an architectural professor facing a student that speaks too much, they stopped the trial and they said to both parties, go home and come back with models. Of course, the human rights people did not know how to build a model, and they went to the military company that produces models for military training. And strangely, the first model of the wall ever built was not built by the people constructing the wall, but by people opposing it as evidence against it. And here you see the model sitting on the table of Mohammed Dahle in Jerusalem as a piece of evidence. And if you look at it very carefully, you would see this is settlement. This is in red. You would see the line where the state started to build the wall in the West Bank. Here, the green line separates the areas occupied in 48 from those occupied in 67. So this is internationally conceived as accepted as the international border. And you see the blue line, which is somehow referred to in my book as the best of all possible walls, or the lesser evil wall. It is the proposal by the human rights group to build a wall that is a little bit more considerate. But you would see, if you're kind of a nerd like I am for looking carefully at evidence, that the blue line actually crosses the green line into Israel proper and then exits here. As if to say, if you want to build that wall, build it also in your own yard. But by doing that, they actually did not provide a possibility for that to become a blueprint of construction. So it's a kind of like an architectural rhetorical trick. 10 days later, the model comes into court, the porters bring it in, they're trying to look for a place to put it, but nobody has thought about a presentation of architectural models in court. The porters are going round and round themselves in circles, they don't know where to put it. Somebody has an idea, they call for a table from the cafeteria, they're running, but the cafeteria table is too low, and the judge's bench is too high, and it's basically kind of just right under them, and they cannot see it. And in Israel, as I'm sure in any other place, you would say judges have no legs, they can be with underwear or flip-flops, and they never kind of leave their bench. For the first time ever, they go under the model, they call both parties around them, and assemble around the model. And now the physical, material presence of the model start transforming the language of the law itself. So no longer everybody is saying your honor or learned friend or whatever you say here about this situation, but the legal process becomes a design process. The presence of the model shifts the legal language, breaks the hierarchy between the parties, and both judges, the military, and human rights people start planning, pulling and pushing the wall along that process by themselves. In the book, I provide the entire kind of protocol of discussion. This is our Chief Justice Barak studying a particular contentious detail on it. So what has happened? The greater evil to the lesser evil wall, about 400 meters as the crow fly at best. Is it a legal victory? I would say that the kind of the very elasticity of the wall that brings into relation all sides and in fact kind of create a sort of a field of participation. No, I mean that kind of banal process where we can see, untrained people, just people pointing at models, has led to a almost horrific situation by which the victims of that wall has been involved in designing their own modes of incarceration. That here is another, what I think is a more appropriate political activism that happens along the wall. Every Friday, both Israelis and Palestinians, a kind of binational group of activists are going into that area. And in one of those occasions, one of the activists actually got killed, which led to a commission to us or a request to us to see what we could say about his killing, who might have shot and from where, etc., etc. This was a kind of a request of the family itself. And usually in environments, contemporary environments of conflict, you have an enormous amount of activist videos in the area where you have 2 or 3 and you can actually sync them up together. you are able to create a space. So when activists are kind of shooting with their iPhone or whatever it is, they're also harvesting an enormous amount of spatial data that can later be processed. So we call that process video to space analysis. And it starts, this is again kind of work with C2 Studio, where we synced up the three videos. You can see, yeah, this camera is this. So this is what is shown in that camera. So you see exactly the same event from three activist videos, and you would see the moments of impact in a second. So from the video, a kind of a reconstruction of the movements of the camera, the location of all the participants in this event in space, and even in one of the frames, in a single frame, we could see the cartridge coming. So we could build a 3D model of the space itself and kind of reconstruct from it the exact location, which kind of led to sort of the opening of the process, and still we are waiting verdict on this particular trial. But we're now working both for B'Tselem and for the Human Rights Council in Geneva on other aspects of video to space analysis, of kind of basically analyzing spatially various footage in kind of trying to ban, or we are part, or our evidence is kind of, let's say, will be the central part in attempt to ban white phosphorus as a weapon in war. This is research done by, again, with C2 Studio and two researchers and PhD students of mine at Goldsmiths. That is an analysis of the death in high seas of a group of migrants that were, during the Libya war, were basically sent before Gaddafi fell, by Libyan forces to Europe on a small dinghy. As you know, there are thousands of people that are actually dying in the Mediterranean, mainly sub-Saharan African, wanting to migrate to Europe. The problem here was really to turn NATO surveillance against itself. Of course, NATO claims that the Mediterranean is the most surveyed part of the world, that it's both with satellite images, with boats and on the coast, etc., the most closely looked at. So Lorenzo Pezzani and Charles Heller, those researchers of us here, have claimed that if the Mediterranean is the most viewed, in fact, there is also a kind of a right to rescue that come with it. Of course, international laws of the sea stipulate that if you hear an SOS or you see a boat in distress, you must intervene. Non-intervention is, in fact, prosecutable. And therefore, kind of the attempt was to turn NATO surveillance against itself. But the most important tool, again, kind of using rather new techniques, was the recreation of the drift path of that boat that was used by similar software that was developed for finding the Air France plane that went down in the Atlantic from Brazil. So really was used for the, let's say, the richest people. Here we got that's the same person to do that as a service for us, to recreate the kind of the shifting patterns, the shifting currents in the ocean, so that we could recreate the path of the boat and the vessels that it went near that could have intervened, and here you see some of that. I could speak much longer on it, but this is again a kind of a package of evidence that is presented really these days in Strasbourg in a court for human rights against France and Italy, who were operating the navies next to which the migrants in fact have drowned. Another image of Jerusalem and kind of like thinking the idea of a forum perhaps more politically in another example, and this is from a project that I've undertaken with my partners Sandy Hilal and Alessandro Petti in DAAR, our residency in Beit Sahour, Palestine. Beit Sahour is a small town next to Bethlehem, where we in fact work mainly with residents, people that come from Europe, from the US, from different Palestinian cities to work with us. It's a project we've done on Jerusalem, where we were asked to look at the carcass of the Palestinian parliament building that was built slowly during the Oslo years. The Palestinians, in fact, unable to build it or not allowed by the Israelis to build it within the municipal borders of Jerusalem, placed it in the nearest possible place to the old city that they could, just outside the border, right? So if this is the Israeli imposed border of Jerusalem, they've built it so that one side of the building butts directly against the border itself. Of course, the Intifada began and some kind of internal fighting also within the Palestinian Authority or Palestinian political system, and the building was never finished. So for 10 years, it's remained kind of a half ruin, half construction site. And then Israel built a wall that cut it off completely from its polity. And we were looking at it and kind of trying initially to take seriously this idea of building a building against the perceived edge, against the perceived border of Jerusalem. And we realized there are many ideas of many people where this border runs. As you know, Diane, it's not, in fact, that particular border. I mean, there's the wall, which is further in. It does not really, is not marked on the terrain at all. So we have hired a Palestinian cartographer and a kind of a surveyor to actually find where the border runs in this part. And we have, or he has discovered, a cartographic error. So this is the parliament building. And we all thought that this is the border, but in fact, as things are, you know, in our part of the world, you know, we shifted it 15 degrees here, there, blah, blah, and ended up like what is in effect an international border running exactly through the middle of the parliament building. So we thought that is rather interesting because we were by that time already working with some Palestinian scholars and politicians on the idea that how, you know, kind of thinking Palestinian parliament as an institution, and the very idea of both Israeli and politics was always to cut Palestinian polities into West Bank, Gaza, Jerusalem, North West Bank, South Bank, 48, Palestine, etc. Each one with its own parliament, never kind of a single assembly form that could represent everybody. So we thought, oh, that's already kind of a move forward. So that building is in Israel and in Palestine. So that's kind of interesting. But then we realized there's an extra space, there's another space here, and that is the thickness of the line itself. Of course, Diane knows this story very well. It was told by Meron Benvenisti of the drawing of that green line itself. Abdallah and Dayan meet on one of the hills at the supposed end of the 48 war. They want to draw a temporary ceasefire line. They each come with their own Jeep, Dayan with an American Jeep, Abdallah with a Land Rover, a Range Rover, something like that, probably British supplied. They put the map on the bonnet of the Jeep and they draw with a grease pencil the line. So the lines start thin, and then as they arrive at the place in the bonnet where the engine is under, it becomes thicker, then it becomes thinner again, then there's some stones under, so it kind of like bounces. And they don't care because they think, 2 weeks, 3 weeks maximum, we'll start fighting again. So this is just a temporary thing. But of course, that was the end of the war. And the problem was who owns the thickness of the line. You see here again a kind of an issue of forensics, no? Within the drawing itself, or the drawing itself start creating a political reality that is based on the very materiality of the pencil, the temperature of the bonnet, etc., etc. And of course, most international jurisprudence would claim that the line itself, here about 1.20 meters in thickness, at some places 100 meters, is extraterritorial. The thickness of the line is no man's land, right, simply speaking. So what we have in the building is now 3 spaces, Israel, Palestine, and an extraterritorial strip. And that extraterritorial strip became very interesting for us. So, as I said, being nerdy the way we are, we decided to measure it exactly within the space. And then inspired at the same time, Tahrir Square, one of the most beautiful and important acts was people were cleaning it. The cleaning was taking something that was public into a common, making it a space of the people rather than of the state. We decided to clean out that line through the building. So it was a very complicated, long process of basically kind of cleaning what was in effect about 5 centimeters of bird shit and rat shit on the floor. So literally drawing in that shit, marking the edge of the line as kind of like claiming that extraterritorial zone, producing, that kind of one-to-one drawing within the space of the parliament. And then deciding that what we wanted to do, following it out, seeing the buildings it cut across. In fact, within the thickness of that line were all conditions of Palestine. There were fields, there were buildings, there were chicken houses, there were very lavish houses, there were terraces, there were all sorts of things. As we were thinking through that line as it cuts through. And then built it in different places, really kind of recreating the section, the thickness of the line as what we call the common assembly, a kind of extraterritorial space where around which, kind of we were claiming it's still an ongoing project, a sort of that would stand for, in fact, all those that could not be, all those refugees which are outside of Israel and Palestine, in Lebanon, in Syria, etc., in refugee camps and in other places where somehow kind of existing within this sort of parliament in exile. So I just wanted to end with an example that is a little bit less technical and juridical. Thank you very much for listening. Yeah.
It's being recorded. So if you speak into the mic, it gets on. Okay, so I want to know your view on the difference between evidence and interpretation of buildings.
Do you mean the difference between evidence and proof, maybe? No? I mean, because I think that evidence is always exist as and through kind of a discussion and interpretation. I mean, this is something that both in Mengele's Skull book and in Least of All Possible Evils, I mean, if you want to kind of to look, I sort of unpack that rather carefully. But I think that evidence is exactly that which brings itself into discussion, right, within the forum. I don't think that there is a kind of the idea of a proof beyond sort of the discourse that the epistemic frame of the forum would offer you at a particular point. So I think this is why I'm saying the task of forensic architecture is in that way maybe three, right? One is kind of, you produce the drawings, the animations, the models, all the kind of multiple things I've showed you here. The second thing is that they have to live through you as a matter of presentation. You have to be there, It's always like with your fingers showing, animating it, presenting it, defending it. And the third part of it is really that very often in human rights law and international humanitarian law, unlike in criminal law, so in criminal law you always have the courts into which, and the protocols exist, and the thing just, either photographs or representation of the thing or the thing itself would enter the court. In human rights law, the evidence always precedes the forum. It's an easy thing to understand. There is no ICTY for the International Tribunal for Former Yugoslavia before the evidence of the mass grave, the destruction of cities, etc. The evidence calls forth the forum to assemble around it. And I think that, for me, understanding that architectural research needs the forum in order to operate in the world means that we are not only talking about interpretation of the past, but about the creation of the forums to come, right? So the task of forensic architecture, the art of the forum, is to come with, and we are now also working on court design. This is things that I haven't yet showed in different places, mainly now to do with land claims of indigenous people in both Canada and Australia. But the idea of both kind of conceptually and physically inventing the forums within which evidence will come to resonate is important. No? Architectural research cannot exist without inventing its own forums. So it has the act of design that comes from this form of research is not that I research something and then I know how to intervene in it. I need to research something and I need to intervene in creating a forum exactly for that evidence to become a matter of interpretation, debate, investigation, cross-investigation, etc.
You spoke for a moment about how form can be read as sort of a materialization of forces, and that you can sort of use architecture as a media to both register and transmit history, ideas. I'm wondering, in that clearing of the width of the strip, you're at one time registering a history, but also creating a form, creating a space for maybe forces to operate. What were your intentions beyond the simple registration of the thickness of that line on the map? Maybe more specific as to the opening of forces in that liminal zone.
Yeah. No, so, the forces that are operating, again, they run across scale. They're on the scale of the bonnet of the Jeep, right, of the pencil. They're on the scale of geopolitics, recognition of those annexed borders, the way that kind of geopolitics align to support that border to be what it is. So in a sense, within that line, kind of crashes into it all those things, no? From the pencil line to the geopolitics. I think for us, the aim here, and it's really just the beginning of a project that we are working on, is kind of thinking an alternative forum, political forum, right? When we say forensics is the art of the forum, it means that it takes it out of the context of the law. Forensics is the art of the political forum, of the professional forum, of the juridical forum. For us here in that project is a speculation of what is a kind of a common Palestinian assembly that is existing as a kind of a diasporic place also. So, I mean, again, the project operates on many levels, no? I mean, but it always insists that it would connect materiality to abstract, to those abstract things, no? That there is always a link. I think that too often those of us that were kind of seen more as kind of like social architects, and there were the other group who were like the kind of formalist, computer-generated, no? And there's kind of like that polemics kind of really divided the field in a very unproductive way. And I would find myself methodologically much closer to this sort of parametric world where you would say force derived from form, no? And there is a kind of a scientific process that could translate those. Successfully, unsuccessfully, it always has to be backed by your rhetoric capacity of standing in a court or standing in a parliament or standing in any forum and kind of explaining, you know, sort of acting out your research. But in a certain sense, I think those two strands have to marry again. And for me, forensic architecture is a way to bring them together in saying politics is a form-making process. And therefore, politics is matter in movement. We need to look at things exactly when there was something in their materiality, in their formal organization change, and that change in the wall from here to here, or in the bone from, you know, in micromillimeters, right? That moment of change is where an act or where a process, that matter is registered. Not in its kind of static, manifestation. No, it's always matter in movement. I'm absolutely uninterested in kind of regarding or analyzing the kind of static spaces. Thank you. Thank you for listening. Thank you, dear.